It was an ordinary afternoon in the market, the kind of day where nothing feels unusual until suddenly everything changes. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over narrow streets packed with stalls, shouting vendors and people, rushing through with bags in their hands. The air was thick with noise, bargaining voices overlapping with the sounds of carts rolling and motorbikes squeezing through tight gaps. No one noticed her at first. She moved slowly, carefully, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other resting protectively over her belly. She was pregnant, visibly so, and exhaustion showed on her face with every step she took. She had come to the market alone, thinking she could manage a quick visit. Just a few essentials, she told herself. She didn't want to bother anyone. But pregnancy had taken more out of her than she expected. Her breathing grew shallow, her vision slightly blurred, and the noise around her began to feel distant, like she was underwater. She paused near a small vegetable stall, trying to steady herself, telling herself she just needed a moment. That moment never came. Without warning, her knees buckled. The bag slipped from her hand. In a split second, her world tilted, and she collapsed onto the dusty ground, right there in the middle of the crowded market. At first, people froze. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back, unsure what to do. Others looked around, expecting someone else to take responsibility. Time felt like it slowed, but in reality only seconds were passing. Seconds that mattered. Behind the vegetable stall stood a man most people barely noticed. He was thin, his clothes worn and faded from years of sun and dust. His hands were rough, his face lined with hardship. He was one of the poorest vendors in the market, selling a small selection of vegetables laid out on a wooden crate. He didn't have much, barely enough to get through each day, but what he had was something money couldn't buy: the moment. He saw her fall, he didn't hesitate, he rushed around the stall, dropping everything. Kneeling beside her, he gently supported her head, carefully turning her onto her side, the way he remembered seeing once during a medical emergency years ago. His voice was calm but urgent as he called out for help, asking if anyone knew a doctor, a nurse, anyone at all. The woman was unconscious. Her skin looked pale, and her breathing was shallow. The vendor's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay steady. He knew panic wouldn't help her. He loosened her scarf, waved for fresh air, and told the surrounding crowd to give her space. Slowly, people began to listen. Someone offered water. Another person pulled out a phone. But it was the poor vendor who stayed right there, one hand near her shoulder, the other hovering protectively near her belly as if shielding the unborn child from harm. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The woman stirred slightly, letting out a faint sound. The vendor leaned closer, speaking softly, reassuring her even though she couldn't fully hear him. He told her she was safe, that help was coming, that she wasn't alone. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. He suddenly felt an ambulance siren echoed in the distance, growing louder. Relief washed over the vendor's face, but he didn't move until the medics arrived. When they did, they worked quickly, lifting her onto a stretcher, checking her vitals, asking questions. The vendor answered what he could, explaining how she collapsed and what he had done. One of the paramedics looked at him and nodded. "You did the right thing," she said. The words hit him harder than he expected. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren faded, the market slowly returned to its usual chaos. People went back to shopping. Vendors rearranged their stalls. Life moved on, as it always does, but for the poor vendor, nothing felt the same. He stood there, staring at the empty space where the woman had fallen, his hands still shaking slightly. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He didn't think of going viral, of recognition, or of praise. All he thought about was whether she and her baby would be okay. What he didn't know was that someone in the crowd had recorded everything. From the moment she collapsed to the moment the ambulance drove away, the camera had been rolling. And within hours, that video would begin spreading across the internet, touching millions of hearts around the world. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, all that mattered was this: in a world where so many people look away, One poor vendor chose to act. And that single choice would change lives in ways no one could have imagined. And as you'll soon see, what happened next didn't just shock the internet, it transformed the future of everyone involved. The crowd that had gathered after the collapse didn't know what to do next. Some people whispered prayers under their breath, others argued loudly about calling an ambulance, and a few simply stared, frozen by fear. The poor vendor stayed close to the pregnant woman, his knees pressed into the dusty ground, one hand steady near her shoulder without shaking her, just like he had once seen a nurse do. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew panic would only make things worse. Someone finally managed to call emergency services. But the operator's voice on speakerphone warned that traffic was heavy and it might take time. That word time hung in the air like a threat. The woman stirred slightly, her fingers twitching, and a weak sound escaped her lips. The vendor leaned closer, speaking softly, telling her she was not alone, telling her to breathe slowly if she could hear him. He didn't even realize he was doing it, but his voice had taken on the same tone he used when calming frightened customers or hungry children who cried near his stall. A middle-aged woman from the crowd knelt beside them and offered a small bottle of water. The vendor shook his head gently, remembering that giving water to someone unconscious could be dangerous. The woman looked surprised but nodded, clearly relieved that someone seemed to know what they were doing. Another man held up a jacket to create shade from the harsh sun. Bit by bit, the chaos softened into cooperation, all because one poor vendor had taken the first step. The pregnant woman's eyes fluttered open for a moment. They were unfocused, filled with confusion and fear. She whispered something no one could understand. The vendor smiled reassuringly and told her help was coming. He asked her simple questions, just like he'd seen on TV shows, hoping it would keep her alert. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and that gave him a small spark of hope. As they waited, the vendor's mind drifted back to his own life. He thought about how many times people had walked past his stall without seeing him, without even meeting his eyes. He remembered days when he had gone home with barely enough money to eat, nights when he wondered if his life had any meaning beyond survival. Yet here he was, kneeling in the middle of the market, surrounded by strangers, doing something that truly mattered. The thought surprised him, and for a moment, it almost brought tears to his eyes. The sound of sirens finally cut through the noise of the market. People turned their heads toward the street, relief washing over their faces. The vendor felt his shoulders relax slightly, though he stayed focused. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, their movements quick and professional. They asked questions, and several people began talking at once, but the vendor calmly explained what had happened, what he had done, and how long the woman had been unconscious. One of the paramedics looked at him with a mix of surprise and respect. She nodded and said he had done the right things. Those simple words hit him harder than he expected. He stepped back as they carefully lifted the woman onto the stretcher. As they wheeled her away, her hand slipped free from the blanket for a moment, and the vendor noticed her wedding ring catching the sunlight. He silently prayed for her and her unborn child. Just before the ambulance doors closed, the woman's eyes opened again. This time they were clearer. She looked around, confused, then her gaze found the vendor. Their eyes met for a brief second. She didn't speak, but her lips curved into the faintest smile. The doors shut, and the ambulance drove away, leaving behind a market that felt strangely quiet. People slowly returned to their stalls and shopping, but something had changed. A few customers came up to the vendor, patting his shoulder, praising his courage. One man pressed a small bill into his hand, insisting he keep it. The vendor tried to refuse, but the man shook his head firmly. Word spread quickly through the market about what had happened. Strangers who had never noticed him before now greeted him with respect. Later that day, a young man who had filmed parts of the incident on his phone approached the vendor. He explained that the video was already being shared online, that people were calling the vendor a hero. The vendor felt uncomfortable with the word. He shook his head and said he had only done what anyone should do. But that night, as he lay on his thin mattress, the events of the day replayed in his mind again and again. He wondered how the woman was doing, whether her baby was safe. He wondered how many times people underestimated others based on appearance, wealth, or status. The market would open again the next morning, and his life would likely look much the same. He would set up his stall, arrange his goods, and wait for customers. But deep inside, something had shifted. He had seen how one small act could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond a single moment. As the city slept, notifications continued to light up phones across the world, sharing the story of a pregnant woman, a crowded market, and a poor vendor who refused to look away. And though he didn't know it yet, that single decision to act instead of freeze was about to change his life in ways he never imagined. The crowd slowly returned to the market that evening, but the energy was different now. The sounds were softer, conversations more careful, as if everyone had collectively witnessed something that reminded them how fragile life truly is. Word spread fast. By nightfall, almost everyone in the neighborhood knew about the poor vendor who had saved a pregnant woman's life with nothing but courage, quick thinking, and a heart that refused to look away. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly as doctors moved in and out of the room. The woman lay on the bed, her breathing steady now, her face pale but calm. One hand rested protectively on her stomach, the other holding her husband's fingers tightly, as if letting go might bring the fear back. The doctor finally returned with a reassuring smile and explained that both mother and baby were stable. Severe dehydration and sudden drops in blood pressure had caused the collapse, but because help came quickly, no lasting damage had been done. Tears streamed down the husband's face as relief washed over him. He kept repeating the same sentence, again and again, asking where the man was, the one who had helped her before the ambulance arrived. He needed to thank him. He needed to see him. A nurse mentioned that the rescuer was a street vendor who had left before the ambulance even drove away. Back at the market, the poor vendor had returned to his small stall. His hands were shaking slightly as he arranged the remaining fruit, his mind replaying the moment over and over. He hadn't thought about being brave or heroic. He had only seen a human being in danger and reacted. Still, doubt crept in. What if he had done something wrong? What if he had made things worse? He whispered a quiet prayer, hoping the woman and her baby would survive. Just as he was packing up for the night, a group of people approached his stall. At first, he felt nervous, unsure if he was in trouble for causing a scene, but then he recognized the man at the front. It was the pregnant woman's husband. His eyes filled with tears as he stepped forward and grabbed the vendor's hands. "You saved my family," he said, his voice breaking. "If you hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened." The vendor tried to pull his hands away, embarrassed, insisting that he had only done what anyone should do, but the husband refused to let go. People gathered around, listening quietly as the story was retold. Someone recorded the moment on their phone, capturing the raw gratitude, the trembling voices, the honest emotion that couldn't be staged. The next morning, that video was everywhere. Social media exploded with comments, shares, and messages of praise. People were moved not just by the rescue, but by who the rescuer was. A man who struggled to make enough money each day, who owned almost nothing, yet gave everything he had in that moment. News outlets picked up the story. Reporters came to the market, microphones in hand, asking questions about what he had done and why. The vendor answered simply. He said he didn't think about money or status or consequences. He said he saw a pregnant woman collapse, and he knew he couldn't walk away. That honesty resonated deeply. Donations began pouring in from strangers. Around the city, then the country. Some sent small amounts. Others sent messages saying the story had restored their faith in humanity. When the woman was discharged from the hospital a few days later, she asked to meet the man who saved her. They met near the same spot in the market where she had collapsed. This time she stood strong, one hand on her belly, the other reaching out to the vendor. She thanked him with tears in her eyes, telling him that every heartbeat of her unborn child was a reminder of his kindness. What happened next surprised everyone. A local charity, inspired by the story, offered to help the vendor rebuild his life. They provided a proper stall, steady supplies, and support to expand his small business. Customers lined up daily, not out of pity, but respect. The vendor continued to work just as hard as before, but now with a sense of dignity he hadn't felt in years. The story didn't go viral because of shock or drama alone. It spread because it revealed something powerful. In a world where people often look away, one person chose to step forward. One act of kindness created ripples that touched thousands, proving that heroism doesn't wear uniforms or demand applause. As weeks passed, the market returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory lingered. People were quicker to help one another. They checked on strangers. They paid more attention. And every time someone walked past the vendor's stall, they didn't just see a poor man selling fruit. They saw a reminder that humanity still exists in the simplest places. Sometimes life-changing moments don't happen in hospitals or headlines. Sometimes they happen on a dusty market road, when someone collapses and someone else decides not to walk away.